Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, the American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on early Republic foreign affairs and maritime friction. The core question is this: how does a weak republic trade on the Atlantic without letting larger empires dictate its policy and revenue? The core competency is to characterize the foreign affairs challenges facing the young nation, including the War of 1812. How does a weak republic trade on the Atlantic without letting larger empires dictate its policy and revenue? After the Constitution took effect, the United States entered a world still dominated by European empires with larger fleets, broader credit systems, and deeper diplomatic reach. The Republic had won independence, but it had not escaped dependence on Atlantic commerce. American merchants needed access to foreign markets. Coastal towns needed imports and export routes. Customs duties on trade supplied a major share of federal revenue. The same ships that enriched the Republic also exposed it to British and French pressure whenever those powers went to war. That is why foreign affairs in the early Republic cannot be reduced to lofty statements about honor or friendship. They were grounded in seizures at sea, insurance rates, cargo losses, sailor impressment, frontier alliances, and legislative experiments in coercion. George Washington's administration confronted this problem first when war broke out between Britain and Revolutionary France in 1793. The United States had a treaty relationship with France from the American Revolution, but it lacked the military capacity to fight Britain and protect its own trade at the same time. Washington therefore issued the Neutrality Proclamation. The move did not end argument, it redirected it. Could the Republic survive by staying out of European war, or would neutrality merely invite contempt from powers that saw American shipping as useful prey? Neutrality looked attractive because the alternatives were harsh. The United States had a small regular army, no blue water navy worthy of major war at the start of the decade, and a public credit system still under construction under Alexander Hamilton's financial program. Trade, especially with Britain, sustained customs revenue and merchant prosperity. At the same time, many Americans sympathized with France because France had aided the American Revolution and now claimed to be fighting monarchy abroad. Edmond Charles Genet, the French minister known as Citizen Genet, arrived in the United States and tried to recruit American support for French operations. His conduct embarrassed the Washington administration and exposed the difficulty of neutrality inside a politically divided republic. Jay Treaty of 1794 offered one answer. Chief Justice John Jay negotiated with Britain to resolve outstanding disputes from the Treaty of Paris, reduce some immediate tensions, and secure evacuation of British posts in the Northwest. The agreement also provided limited commercial benefits. It did not solve impressment or all maritime disputes. Critics charged that it leaned too far toward Britain and betrayed revolutionary France. Supporters answered that a weak republic had avoided a disastrous war with the strongest navy in the world. The treaty debate hardened party lines because foreign policy at sea immediately shaped domestic politics on land. John Adams then faced the XYZ affair in 1797 and 1798 when French intermediaries demanded bribes before formal negotiations. Public outrage in the United States fed military preparation and naval expansion. The undeclared quasi-war with France followed, fought mainly at sea in the Caribbean and Atlantic shipping lanes. Congress created the Department of the Navy in 1798 and funded new frigates. Privateers, escort duty, convoy practice, and naval captures became part of ordinary federal administration. Foreign affairs were not distant abstractions. They required hulls, cannon, appropriations, officers, dockyards, and legal procedures for captured vessels. Thomas Jefferson inherited the maritime problem and tried to solve it without a major war. British and French forces both interfered with neutral shipping during the Napoleonic Wars. Britain especially angered Americans through impressment, the practice of seizing sailors from ships and claiming them as British subjects or deserters. The 1807 Chesapeake Leopard affair brought the danger close to home when the British warship Leopard attacked the American frigate Chesapeake off the Virginia coast and removed sailors. Jefferson answered not with immediate war, but with the Embargo Act of 1807. The law prohibited most American exports from leaving U.S. ports. Jefferson hoped commercial withdrawal would pressure Britain and France by denying them American goods and shipping services. The embargo turned into an administrative test that the federal government could not fully win. Customs officials had to police coasts, harbors, and land borders against smuggling. Merchants complained about idle ships and rotting produce. New England seaports suffered heavily. Congress passed supplementary enforcement acts because the first embargo law left too many loopholes. Revenue officers, patrol vessels, and local informants tried to stop violations, yet long coastlines and profit incentives encouraged evasion. The Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 and Macon's Bill No. 2 in 1810 revised the strategy rather than settling the underlying issue. Economic coercion had hurt Americans more quickly than it had bent Britain or France. Meanwhile, frontier tensions sharpened the crisis. In the Old Northwest, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa sought to build a native confederacy to resist U.S. expansion. Many Western Americans blamed British influence in Canada for sustaining native resistance, whether or not British control matched rumor in every case. Land hunger in the West and maritime grievance in the East moved together into war politics. Younger congressmen later called war hawks, including Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, pushed for a firmer response. They spoke of national honor, but their pressure also rested on practical frustration. If neutral trade could be seized, sailors impressed, and frontier settlers threatened while the United States answered with failed embargo schemes, then the Republic looked weak in both oceanic and continental terms. James Madison, president in 1812, confronted that convergence. Congress declared war on Britain in June 1812. The United States entered the conflict unprepared in several ways. It had a small army, relied heavily on short-term militia, and attempted early invasions of Canada that failed. Yet the war also stimulated federal administration. Treasury demands rose. Contracts for arms and supplies expanded. Naval victories and single-ship engagements provided morale. Western operations against native Confederacy forces and British allies changed the balance in the Great Lakes and Northwest Theater. Maritime friction had finally become declared war. Washington's farewell address in 1796 offers the clearest statement of the early republic's foreign policy dilemma. He warned against permanent alliances and against emotional attachment or animosity toward particular nations. The advice came from weakness as much as wisdom. The United States lacked the force to shape Europe. It needed time, credit, and distance from imperial wars. Washington was trying to preserve that time. Washington's warning grows sharper when set beside later events. Neutrality did not remove the United States from the Atlantic system. American ships still sailed. European navies still searched, seized, and impressed. Merchants still ensured voyages against capture. Customs collectors still measured the federal government's survival through trade receipts. Washington's caution, therefore, appears less as a timeless moral command and more as a strategic doctrine for an underpowered commercial republic. It told Americans what prudence required. It could not guarantee that Britain or France would honor that prudence. The line about avoiding habitual hatred and passionate attachment also struck domestic politics directly. Federalists often leaned towards stable commercial relations with Britain. Jeffersonian Republicans more often distrusted Britain and remembered revolutionary France with sympathy, even after the French Revolution became more violent. Foreign affairs split newspapers, elections, and definitions of patriotism. The farewell address is valuable because it shows how early leaders tried to restrain those passions while operating inside a trade system that kept reactivating them. Congressional legislation tracks that escalation clearly. The Naval Act of 1794 authorized 6 frigates after earlier hesitation about the cost of a permanent navy. Revenue cutters already patrolled customs waters and tried to suppress smuggling. During the Quasi-War, Congress authorized captures of French armed vessels, funded officers and dockyards, and expanded convoy practice for merchant shipping. Foreign affairs required bureaucracy, payroll clerks, customs collectors, harbor officials, naval yards, and prize courts to process captured ships and cargoes. Neutrality was never passive. It had to be administered. The War of 1812 ended with the Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814 and effective in 1815, restoring the status quo ante bellum without settling every issue that had helped begin the conflict. News of Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans arrived after the treaty had been signed, magnifying nationalist memory even though it did not shape the treaty itself. The Hartford Convention damaged the Federalist Party by making opposition appear disloyal at the wrong time. British support for native resistance in the Northwest weakened after the war. Many Americans later remembered the conflict as a second war of independence. The war also exposed logistics repeatedly. American attempts to invade Canada in 1812 suffered from poor coordination, militia reluctance to cross the border, and weak supply planning. On the water, Oliver Hazard Perry's victory on Lake Erie in 1813 changed events because ship timber, rope, guns, crews, and transport had finally been organized well enough to challenge British control in a crucial theater. The British burning of Washington in 1814 showed how exposed the capital remained. Congress could declare war, but declaration alone did not create magazines, roads, fortifications, and trained officers. That memory contains part of the truth but misses the administrative lesson. The early republic spent 2 decades trying to defend commerce, honor, and autonomy with tools that were often mismatched to the scale of British and French power. Neutrality was necessary but porous. Jay Treaty bought time, but not full security. The Quasi-War proved the need for naval institutions. The Embargo Act demonstrated how hard it was to coerce larger empires through trade stoppage. The War of 1812 confirmed that the United States would defend sovereignty, yet it also exposed the limits of militia reliance, poor coordination, and weak logistical preparation. Shipping costs and marine insurance deepened that lesson. Merchants did not experience foreign policy only as patriotic principle. They experienced it through premiums, delayed cargoes, confiscated goods, and court cases over captured vessels. Port ledgers and customs receipts therefore became another record of foreign pressure. When seizures rose, commerce and federal revenue felt the impact quickly. The Treaty of Ghent also shows the limit of American leverage. The agreement ended the war without a clear written settlement of impressment, and the practice declined largely because the wider European war had ended. Some of the pressure disappeared because the imperial context changed, not because the United States had fully imposed its preferred terms. Regional economies felt those choices differently. New England merchants worried about embargoes and port closures. Western settlers focused on British-backed native resistance and access to river routes. Southern exporters watched shipping interruptions cut into staple sales. One foreign policy crisis could therefore produce several domestic political maps at once. The government also learned from failure. Naval administration, customs enforcement, military contracting, and wartime finance all grew more substantial after 1812. The Republic did not become a world power overnight, but it did become more experienced in linking law, revenue, and force. Private merchants learned from failure as well. Convoys, insurance adjustments, safer routes, and closer attention to customs and naval policy all became part of commercial calculation. Foreign affairs stayed on the wharf, in the counting house, and in the treasury at the same time. Dock records and customs books preserved that lesson in routine form, alongside admiralty filings, insurance claims, and consular letters from threatened ports. The unresolved judgment remains difficult. Should early American leaders have clung longer to commercial restraint and diplomatic patience, or did the pattern of seizures and impressment make war unavoidable by 1812? The record does not support a simple answer. Washington's caution fit a weak state. Jefferson's embargo showed the limits of non-war coercion. Madison's war answered accumulated pressure but brought its own failures. The sea kept forcing the Republic to choose between dependence and force, and those choices shaped the growth of the federal state long before the United States became a great power. Commerce, seizures, and impressment kept forcing the Republic to choose between dependence and force. The harder judgment is whether restraint preserved independence better than war, or whether repeated maritime coercion made war unavoidable by 1812. Either answer leaves a republic trying to grow without surrendering control of its own policy.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.